At the beginning of this century, no living European had set eyes on Lhasa, this holy city of Tibet. Tibet was a forbidden land.
We have explored to the ends of the earth, but this one country remains unseen, unvisited, shrouded in impenetrable mystery on the roof of the world. Tibet is one of the last secret places on earth. It is out of bounds and it stirs men's curiosity. What is this unknown country of monks and monasteries with its god-king, the Dalai Lama?
This film tells the story of the unveiling of Tibet. But the Tibet that is revealed in this film is gone forever. In 1950, the Chinese invaded and swept away the old order. Now you'll never see the Tibet that 80 years ago so stirred men's curiosity. Then, concealed behind the Himalayas, Tibet was one mystery that the 19th century had left to the 20th to explore. In 1900, the Himalayas mark the northern border of the British Indian Empire. It stretches 2,000 miles from China in the east to Afghanistan in the west, a buffer state between the British and the expanding Russian Empire. To the north is Tibet, a no man's land between rival powers. 1903, with imperial pomp and ceremony, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, enters Delhi. Lord Curzon has urged a forward policy in Afghanistan and Tibet. There are rumors concerning the Russians.
There seems little doubt that Russian agents have been in Lhasa. The Tibetans totally refused to answer the Viceroy's letter.
Whatever the Russian designs on India, I hold that the first duty of an English statesman is to render any hostile intention futile. A bold move might thwart the Russians. We must have a treaty with the Tibetans. Since they refuse to talk to us, we must send a mission to Lhasa.
The expedition assembled at Siliguri on the borders of Sikkim, 400 miles from Lhasa.
The mission is to be led by Colonel Younghusband. The escort 8th Gurkhas, 23rd Sikh Pioneer...
Ain't this ripping, I wrote to my wife. It really was rather fun. There's something so compelling about forbidden cities. We were just like schoolboys with excitement.
Cheer, boys, cheer, the country for the country. Cheer, boys, cheer, the willing, strong, right.
I met two major generals. Each independently remarked that Tibet would be an A1 place for curios. The pass which leads into Tibet is at 14,400 feet. There's something so strange about the atmosphere at such an altitude. One feels one were on another planet. The Tibetans had built a wall right across our line of march. Our orders were to advance to Lhasa, to negotiate a treaty but avoid a battle. Theirs, they said, to avoid a battle but oppose our advance. It was absurd. We marched right up to their wall and started to wrest their muskets from them. The situation was very tense. They just walked away. Why, in the name of all their Buddhas, didn't they run? It was a most dismal victory. We plunged on into the unknown towards Lhasa.
Bang upon the bank drum, clash upon the cymbals, we'll sing as we go marching along, boys, along.
There was tremendous excitement. Tomorrow, August the 4th, 1904, when we enter Lhasa, the forbidden city of the Dalai Lama, an epoch in the world's history will have been marked. We will have unveiled the last mystery of the East. It is nearly 100 years since Thomas Manning, the only Englishman until today who ever saw Lhasa, preceded us. We found the city squalid and filthy, medieval. It must have been the same for centuries. The Tibetans didn't consider themselves the least degree conquered. And above all this, the Potala, the abode of the Dalai Lama. That frowning cliff of 1,000 sightless windows and hidden corridors. It captured and held the imagination. The lamas behind those blind walls, invoking the aid of their magic to overthrow the intruders who had destroyed the inviolability of their sacred place. The Dalai Lama had achieved the impossible, vanished, been spirited into the air. His flight was really a secret. It added fearfully to the mystery of the place. For 2 months, we were in Lhasa attempting to find an official who, in the absence of the Dalai Lama, would agree terms. We wanted the Tibetans to have no dealings with any foreign power, i.e. the Russians, without first consulting us. That was the crux of the matter.
Eventually, someone was found to sign the treaty. On October the 6th, 1904, the British marched out. The veil had been briefly drawn aside, but the air of mystery about the Forbidden City remained. Now, for nearly 20 years, no European was to go beyond Gyansi, halfway to Lhasa, where, under the terms of the treaty, a British trade agency was established. Some 6 years later, 2 British sergeants at a telegraph post on India's border with Tibet were woken by the unexpected news that the Dalai Lama was outside. He had fled this time from invading Chinese, who claimed Tibet to be part of China. The Dalai Lama was escorted into India. He stayed in India for 2 years, much of the time at the residency of the British political officer in Sikkim, Charles Bell, here with his secretary. A great friendship developed between Charles Bell and the Dalai Lama. When the Chinese were expelled from Tibet in 1912, the Dalai Lama returned to Lhasa, and Charles Bell was invited to visit him. Where Bell's invitation had opened the way, his successors as British political officers in Sikkim were later able to follow. When, in 1932, another political officer in Sikkim, a Major Weir and his wife, went to Lhasa for this, their second visit, they took with them their daughter, Joan Mary.
I was only 19 at the time, so you can imagine it was the most thrilling thing that could possibly happen. To actually go, have a chance to go to Lhasa, the Forbidden City. The journey took about 3 weeks, and the exciting thing was it was a place nobody else went to.
The very inaccessibility of Tibet was part of its allure. There was only this one route to Lhasa. Yaks and mules the only transport possible across the Himalayas onto the high plateau of Tibet. It was the same route that young husband had taken nearly 30 years earlier. The first stage of the journey up from India was familiar to British political officers responsible for relations with Tibet. An essential qualification for them was to have done a spell as British trade agent at Gyansi, Tibet's second largest town, halfway to Lhasa. But even the political officers could not go much beyond Gyansi without a special invitation from Lhasa. Outside Gyansi, the Sangpo River was the barrier that could not be crossed without that invitation. Since the Russian Revolution, the Russian threat to India, real or imaginary, had faded. The northern border of the Indian Empire seemed secure, and the British had preferred to leave Tibet alone. It hopefully encouraged others, notably the Chinese, to do so. Bell had waited 8 years before being allowed to accept his invitation to visit the Dalai Lama. But in 1932, Tibet was having trouble with the Chinese on our eastern border. Major Weir had succeeded in getting himself invited up to Lhasa to help find a solution. Britain was anxious to maintain good relations with both China and Tibet. It was a sign of how rarely any European visited Lhasa that those few who did invariably took movie cameras with them. Outside Lhasa, Weir was welcomed by a guard of honor from the Tibetan army. The first duty of the political officers on arriving at Lhasa was to visit the Dalai Lama, the mysterious god-king of Tibet. He could be quite worldly, as the wife of Weir's successor recalls.
He got down from his throne and had 2 chairs brought in, and he and I sat together. And we went on eating fresh peaches, whilst Derek showed him Charlie Chaplin. And then we just sat and talked. But it was all quite informal. What impressed me were his ears. They're so huge. And he had piercing eyes. He never missed a trick. And he had very long fingernails. You know, you felt him inspired you with something, only to be in his presence.
In 1935, 2 years later, the Williamsons went again to Lhasa, accompanied by a Dr. Guthrie. The 13th Dalai Lama had died the previous year. While the Tibetans searched for the child in whom the God of mercy would return, a regent was to preside at Lhasa. The purpose of this visit was to greet the regent on his installation, to mediate in yet another dispute the Tibetans were having with the Chinese, and to further good relations between the British and Tibet.
The Potala, every time you saw it, it always impressed you. Little town of Lhasa had about 20,000 people in it. All the shops, they're not inside anything. They just put these shades up and you could buy anything practically.
The first duty for the British mission was to receive the Tibetan cabinet and the Prime Minister.
And then after that we had a children's party. There'd never been one in Lhasa before, and they thoroughly enjoyed that. And they had all these races, egg and spoon, and data races, sack races. And Dingsha, he was head of the police, a big man. He came and helped. We also gave a firework party, and that was a roaring success. And we had the Catherine wheels and the rockets and, you know, the things that blazed and bangs. And, well, of course, it had never been heard of up there before. It was part of the mission to visit the monasteries, particularly Drepung, where there were reputed to be 7,700 monks. Most of them had to keep to their rooms in case they got out of hand, a curiosity. It was about a mile from the road and really looked like either Malta or the Riviera. It was so big, it had 4 colleges, and we went through them all, and the kitchens. Another thing we did was to give an ashilamo, which is a religious play, and it lasted for 3 days. We had the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, all the different ranks of officials. A man is put into a trance, and he's supposed to give birth to a baby. Of course, I roared with laughter. It was all fun, make-believe.
After the Williamsons had been nearly 2 months in Lhasa, the regent finally arrived from the monastery of Retting, 60 miles from Lhasa.
Once the regent had arrived in Lhasa, we called on him. He was 24, he didn't suffer good health, but he had a very active brain. He would remain as regent till Dalai Lama was found, and after that until the Dalai Lama could take over.
Frederick Williamson had been ill for some time. He died in Lhasa. To continue his work, another mission went to Lhasa the following year. It was led by Basil Gould, who had succeeded Williamson as political officer in Sikkim.
We were a large party. Philip Neame, VC, came to give the Tibetan government such advice as they might need on military matters. And Hugh Richardson, on my right here, came on with us up to Lhasa.
I'd known Sir Basil Gould in the Northwest Frontier, and he knew I was interested in Tibet, and he very kindly sent for me as his assistant political officer. Well, the purpose was the same, basically, as all the preceding missions, but had a sharper intention because after the death of the 13th Dalai Lama, the Chinese had managed to get a small mission into Lhasa, and there seemed no good reason why we should leave them holding the field. When Sir Basil Gould found he had to go back to his post in Sikkim, he simply informed the Tibetan government that I would be staying on to deal with outstanding questions. And the Chinese didn't go, and we didn't go. Nobody had really been in Lhasa for so long, and we had to find out who was important and who was friendly, and to get to know how the Tibetans thought and how they lived. Tibetan society were always conscious that it had two aspects. One was the layman and the other was the monk. And the monks were the most important part of it. Well, Lhasa as a town was essentially a small medieval city. It was also comparable with the Middle Ages in the way that pilgrimage was extremely important.
Tibet had a small population, about 2 million, spread over a country half as large as Europe. Outside Lhasa, on the high plateau, the majority of the people were nomads, living in yak hair tents. Much of Tibet was at an altitude of 14,000 feet, the land bare and barren. At lower levels, though, good crops of barley were grown in the river valleys by peasant farmers. For all the people of Tibet, Lhasa was very much the heart of the country.
Lhasa was the heart and soul of Tibet. The whole government was centered there, apart from district offices in remote parts, and it was, and had been for centuries, the center of religion. The monk population was largely centered outside the city of Lhasa in 2 or 3 great monasteries. The biggest of them had up to 10,000 monks and contained large temples and assembly halls and colleges for the monks to live in. It was always supposed that a third of the male population in Tibet became monks. It was possible to be chosen to enter a monastery from the age of 5 or 6. It was considered a matter of pride and prestige for the family to have at least one monk in the monastery. They were trained in the reading of religious texts, and a very important activity was debating religious problems of great complexity. And they would meet in little parks attached to the monastery and spend hours in a rather formalized form of debating and discussion. Like a medieval monastery, they were a community. They had cooks, they had sweepers, they had police, they had musicians, and those who were skilled in ritual.
Monks also held an important place in government. When Hugh Richardson was in Lhasa, the main concern of the Tibetan government was to find the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama.
And the most promising candidate they found was discovered in territory under Chinese control. You know, the question was, how could they get him back to Lhasa without Chinese influence coming back? And there were very prolonged negotiations about that. In fact, eventually the Tibetan government had to buy him, and we helped them with that. We provided them with a lot of silver so that they could pay the ransom. And a special party went out to a huge reception camp to meet him and to bring him in state. And I went out on the day, and very early, and we all waited, and there was tremendous excitement in Lhasa about his coming. It took a very long time, and this was a very small boy. He was under 5 when he arrived. He behaved with the most superb composure. The formal installation in the Potala didn't take place until the next year, early the next year, when Sir Basil Gould came on a special mission for the purpose with proper presents for the occasion.
No European had ever before been present in Lhasa at the installation of a Dalai Lama. In the audience hall, the column of those seeking a blessing was held back. All seemed to be aware that they were in the presence of a presence. He was seated in the gloom, high on his throne, cross-legged in the attitude of Buddha. A white scarf was placed around my neck, and 2 small, cool hands laid steadily on my head. And so the brief audience ended. Our gifts were presented to the monks who had charge of the Dalai Lama, and within minutes the Dalai Lama's 8-year-old brother was on the spot to find out how everything worked. 8 days after our audience, a mile-long riot of color assembled to escort the Dalai Lama from the Norbulinka Summer Palace to the Potala.
Well, I think we'd known before we went to Lhasa that everybody who'd been there before had found the Tibetans very good company indeed, very hospitable and good-mannered. We used to have large garden parties in which officials came with their wives and their children, and we gave them a large lunch and usually a cinema show and played games in the garden. When one's first exposure to Tibet, you had a sense of wonderment and excitement, which gave way to the understanding that you were living in a very well-ordered society. It was medieval, and it was deliberately so, in a way, deliberately undeveloped materially. Spiritually and in general intelligence, it was highly developed. The British in India regarded Tibet as a very convenient buffer between themselves and China. The frontier was virtually unmanned. They didn't need to have any defenses on the frontier. There was no danger of invasion or hostile forces of any sort along the whole of that long frontier from Ladakh all the way to Assam.
The Chinese, however, had always considered Tibet to be part of China. In 1943, a new nationalist Chinese commissioner, Dr. Shen Sung-lien, came to Lhasa. He filmed his own arrival and later wrote of it.
The moment you set foot in Tibet, you wonder, can this really be Shangri-La, the promised wonderland? It is bleak and barren, wrapped in silence. When you draw near the heart of the hermit kingdom, you begin to realize that you are heading into a society fossilized many years back. Outside Lhasa, I was welcomed by members of the Chinese community and officials of the Tibetan government. I had been charged to keep open the caravan route to war-torn China, to counter British influence and to strengthen the ties between China and Tibet. Since 1911, Tibet has to all practical purposes enjoyed full independence. But Tibet and China for many hundreds of years have been bound by a spiritual and earthly connection. The Buddhist religion of Tibet, guarded by the aid and protection of China, a relationship that has been weakened by wars and revolution in China.
Tibet in the 1940s was still the forbidden land, closed to all foreigners except these few political officers, British and Chinese, countering each other's influence on the fringes of their respective empires. But there is today one European, an Austrian, who came to know Tibet at this time more intimately than any other, and by way of very different circumstances.
In 1939, I was climbing in the Himalayas when the Second World War broke out. We were interned by the British in India, and together with a friend, I escaped from the prison camp, and after crossing the Himalayas and wandering for about 2 years, we reached Lhasa. It was January the 15th, 1946, when we for the first time saw the gleaming golden roofs of the Potala. We felt inclined kneeling down on our knees, like the Tibetan pilgrims do when they for the first time see this holy palace of the Dalai Lama. It was late in the afternoon when we reached this famous western gate. We walked just through together with all the other pilgrims, with the merchants, with farmers, with caravans, with donkeys bringing loads into Lhasa. We had read so much about this holy city. It was forbidden. The whole country was forbidden. And now we had reached the dream of our lives.
Some years after he left Lhasa, Heinrich Harrer wrote the story of his 7 years in Tibet.
To this day, I can find no words to express how overwhelming were our sensations. Our minds, exhausted by hardship, could not absorb the shock of so many and such powerful impressions. Lhasa, it was like some forgotten fairy tale of the East. Nobody stopped us or bothered us. We realized that no one, not even a European, was suspect because no one had ever before come to Lhasa without a pass. It is probable that no country in the world would welcome two poor fugitives as Tibet welcomed us. The world we had come from was still at war, half Europe was in ruins, and our country was going through hard times. We had nowhere else to go. After the initial furor of our unexpected arrival in Lhasa, we were invited to stay at the house of the famous Sarong. Sarong, a former cabinet minister, was now in charge of the Lhasa Mint. His was a large house with a beautiful garden. Everyone wanted to see us. We were the talk of the town and had a constant stream of visitors, many of whom became good friends. I was to live in Lhasa for 5 years and became an employee of the Tibetan government. Among our visitors were many highly placed monks who courteously brought gifts. I got to know many of them well when I later became a friend of the young Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, the living Buddha, a child, but the heart of the concentrated faith of thousands. In the spring, he would leave the Potala in a gorgeous procession for the summer palace. It marked the beginning of the warm season. Pilgrims from the remotest parts of Tibet would undergo countless hardships in order to witness once in their lives this brilliant manifestation of their religious faith. First came servants with the God King's personal effects, carried in bundles. At an interval behind rode monks with banners decorated with texts. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the British national anthem. I learned later that the bandmaster had been trained in India. High dignitaries and senior members of the God King's household, all monks with the rank of abbot, were approaching, and behind them the yellow silk-lined palanquin of the Dalai Lama himself. Behind the Dalai Lama came the secular authorities in descending order of rank. We could not close our hearts to the religious fervor that radiated from everyone. Religion is the heart and fabric of Tibet, the daily life of the people ordered by their religious beliefs. The fourth month of the year is the holy month, the month of 100,000 merits. From the first day, men and women, rich and poor, walk the Lingko, the holy walk round Lhasa. It is the most popular way to acquire merit, for this is the month Lord Buddha was born, and the effect of every deed one does is multiplied 100,000 times. In all my years in Tibet, I never met anyone who expressed the slightest doubt about the truth of Lord Buddha's teachings. Pious texts are constantly on their lips. Prayer wheels turn unceasingly. Whole families are out to walk the Lingko. Husbands, wives, children, servants, all murmuring their prayers. The more zealous ones do prostrations. They measure their full length on the ground. Others, for whom this is not enough, measure their width, the whole distance. Charity is poured upon beggars, for giving of charity brings added merit. Some sit beside running streams, dipping images of Buddha into the current. On the 15th of the month, the whole body of government officials in their brilliant silk costumes is led by the 4 cabinet ministers around the holy walk. There is a beautiful and informal festival on this day at the Dragon Temple, on an island in a lake behind the Potala. There's a holiday atmosphere. Wine and food shops spring up. Picnic parties are everywhere. The government ministers preside over a small ceremony in the Dragon Temple. Afterwards, they are rowed around the island in hide boats, and they sink 5 treasures into the lake as a dedication to the gods. After a short time in Tibet, it was impossible for me to kill a fly. It may be the reincarnation of a dead relative. If at a picnic an insect falls into a cup of tea, it is a catastrophe. It must at all costs be saved from drowning. The Tibetans are a gentle, laughter-loving people. Everyone scrambles for a ride to the island. Happy crowds throng the banks to watch the fun. To the citified people of Lhasa, the summer means camping and picnics. Among the common folk in particular, the best traditions of nomadic life are kept alive. In the 5th month, they put up their tents in the groves along the Kichu River, crowding certain spots till it is like a bazaar, for a week or a fortnight or even longer. People play games and mahjong and musical instruments. Inside the tents, parties and more games are going on with much laughter. The camping season is a time enjoyed by everyone. By now, we were beginning to feel at home and accepted in Lhasa. When we first arrived, we had been afraid that we would be sent back to internment in India at the request of the British government.
Hugh Richardson, being the representative of the British government, and since we had escaped from a British prison camp in India, he still had in his files the order to get us out of the country. Of course, India, as everybody knows, became independent country, and Richardson had to be replaced by an Indian officer. But that took another year because the Indians hadn't a proper man to replace Richardson, so he stayed on for another year. But then it was irony of fate. The man, Hugh Richardson, who had tried us to get us out of Tibet, it was we who went to the Kichu River and waved farewell to him when he had to leave Lhasa before us.
All the turmoils and changes in the world had passed Tibet by. Here, life continued its obligatory course. The 7th month is the time of opera. Vast throngs of people come to see a flower show and dramatic performances given on a great stone stage in the garden of the Summer Palace. I could not but be astonished at the frankness of some of the performances. It is proof of the good humor and sanity of the people that they can make fun of their own weaknesses and even of their religious institutions. Men appear dressed as nuns. It brings the house down. In the autumn, the Dalai Lama would return from the Noblinka with pomp and circumstance to the Potala. It marked the end of the warm season and the beginning of winter. I would feel sad for the child god who was now to be isolated in that dark and gloomy fortress, while in the town below, other children were enjoying themselves. Despite its altitude, snow is rare in Lhasa, even in winter. Winter is the time of the New Year, celebrated in Tibet by the Great Prayer Festival on the last day of the old year, the 29th day of the 12th month, which falls in our February. There is a dance drama in the stone courtyard of the eastern wing of the Potala. It is a solemn drama concerning the chastisement of evil spirits by black-hatted priests. The climax of the show comes when the leading priest tosses a cup full of wine onto a picture of a demon in a boiling pot of oil. And the New Year festivals begin. Every year, a man climbs a high pole erected below the Potala to a revolving plank to amuse the vast crowds which pack the narrow streets of Lhasa for the 3-week festival. All the civil servants take part in archery competitions, a tradition dating back to Mongol times. On the 3rd day, the 20,000 monks from the great monasteries descend into Lhasa, doubling its population. It is the start of a strict and formidable regime. For 3 weeks, the monks take over the running of the town. It symbolizes the return of secular power to religion, where ultimately all power lies. The abbots of the three great monasteries proceed to the Jokang Cathedral in the center of Lhasa. There the magistrates of the city hand over their keys of office and bow before the new powers. The 15th day of the new year is one of the great days. From the windows of one of Sarong's houses overlooking the main street, we saw strange frame-like objects rising from the ground. They were for sculptures made by the monks out of butter of different colors. In the evening, there is a competition between monasteries in the production of these masterpieces, but by daybreak they will have vanished. Their destruction is to drive home the Buddhist theme that all life is transitory and has no more substance than dreams. In front of the cathedral, the abbots ruling Lhasa seat themselves in preparation for the arrival of two ceremonial generals and their attendants. The generals lead an army of 1,000 soldiers in ancient armor. Long ago, a Muslim army marching on Lhasa was overtaken by heavy snowstorms. The arms and armor of the frozen soldiers were brought in triumph to Lhasa, and now they are brought out every year as these soldiers wage their phantom war against the forces of evil. The New Year ceremonies were not yet at an end. Now came an athletics gathering. This too was an important ritual that had to be performed. We watched it from the second floor of the Chinese legation. Men came out of the crowd to take each other on in wrestling bouts that had their own particular rules. There was no distinction between winners and losers. Both got a reward. Next came a weightlifting competition. The weight, a very heavy, smooth stone which must have seen hundreds of New Year festivals. On the 24th of the month, the state oracle, who when in a trance is consulted on important matters of state, is brought from the cathedral to an immense religious ceremony. In front of the Potala, where there is a vast gathering of monks, the state oracle predicts specific events for the year to come. His trance over, the oracle faints and is borne away on a palanquin, while the monks converge on two vast brushwood pyres on which effigies of a skull, symbolizing the evils of the past year, are ceremonially burnt. The last event of the Great Prayer Festival is a test of horsemanship, the most popular of all the spectacles. It is probably a survival of former great military parades. In the past, feudal lords had at certain times to march their troops past their overlord to show their readiness for war. It recalls the warlike days of the Mongols, when marvelous feats of horsemanship were the order of the day. The general's assistants announce that each contingent is present and correctly attired. Then, when the competitors themselves have paid their respects to their commander, the games can begin. The great festivals are really an occasion for displaying pomp and power, and the high dignitaries know that they owe it to the people to make a good show. The common people enjoy no luxury themselves, but appreciate it in their betters. When on the last day of the festival, the four cabinet ministers exchange their costly headdresses for the red-fringed hats of their servants in order to show for a moment their equality with the people, the enthusiasm and admiration of the public knows no bounds. I was enjoying life in Tibet and had made many friends. It was an archaic country, intentionally undeveloped in our sense, but in its own special way, it was a sophisticated cultural society, and it worked. The people were happy with the way they lived. These games were held each year on the open ground behind the Potala, in front of the house where in 1904 young husband had stayed. Then he and his mission were the first Europeans of the time to see Lhasa. I didn't know it then, but I, 45 years later, was to be the last European to see the old Tibet. The Chinese were about to enforce their claim that Tibet is part of China.
It was about during the New Year's celebrations in 1949 that the Tibetans, and especially the government, realized the real threat of the Chinese communists. They had already conquered Xinjiang, Turkestan in the north, and even the parts bordering eastern Tibet. The Tibetans were afraid of being occupied by the Chinese. They knew, of course, that the Chinese communists will not tolerate their religion. Then one day the Tibetan government decided to expel the whole Chinese mission in Lhasa. They were complimented out with a big band of musicians and scarves around their necks. And for the Tibetans it meant that they wanted to show to the whole world that they are an independent country. I realized, of course, myself that the writing was on the wall of the old Tibet, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama said the threat is so imminent, you must leave right away. You might be the first they will take prisoner. I'd escaped from the British into Tibet, and it was certainly the last place in the world from where you had thought you would have to escape again.
In 1950, the Chinese invaded. Today, nothing remains of that Tibet that 80 years ago was called the One Mystery the 19th century had left to the 20th to explore.